First of all, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the seminar series of the Mass AI and Technology Center for Aging and AD Care. My name is Deepak Ganesan. I'm a professor of computer science at UMass Amherst. I'm one of the co-directors of the center together with Dr. Nitish Chowdhury, and we have a number of the executive committee members of the center here as well. So on behalf of all of us, I'd like to invite everybody to this seminar. So just as a brief note on the overall goals here, we're really trying to get speakers on both sides. So people working on the AI and technology side who know what are the cutting edge techniques and devices that are coming in, and then people working on the needs side, right? The clinicians, the behavioral scientists. So we understand the problem that they face. So really this is an effort at matchmaking and trying to bridge the gap between these two ends. Our speaker, Dr. Diane Cook, has really done a lot of interdisciplinary work at exactly this divide. So she has worked on this boundary for a while now, and she'll be talking to us about this new idea of a digital twin, which for those of you who don't know this term, digital twin is really this you're representing something in the real world by its virtual entity, and you hear this in many other contexts as well. I think today there was this news about a digital twin for the Earth's observation, where you have a lot of data about, and then there's Lockheed Martin, NVIDIA, and other companies coming together to create this digital twin to predict environmental, weather patterns and disaster, various other anomalous weather patterns. So it's a very interesting concept, and I think really timely because the amount of data we can collect is increasing. Introduction of our speaker, Dr. Diane Cook is a Regents professor in the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Washington State. She directs the Center for Advanced Studies in Adaptive Systems, and she directs also the AI laboratory. She's an IEEE fellow. She's a member of the National Academy of Inventors. So she's very well known in this field, and she was working on a lot of these technologies, smart technologies and wearables, well before all of these became buzzwords. With that, we look forward to a great discussion. Thank you, Diane, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for that great introduction and for starting the talk off by giving a description, explanation of what a digital twin is. As Deepak mentioned, I've been working in machine learning for a long time. So kind of shaping machine learning challenges to tackle technology for aging has been a result of my fusing my work in machine learning with the expertise of colleagues around me. So I need to acknowledge Maureen Schmitter-Edgecombe at Washington State, who works in cognitive neuropsychology, Shelley Fritz, who's a professor in nursing. And just by us getting together and brainstorming, what can we do to achieve a vision of personalized health assessment and intervention, did we start to form this idea of data mining a human digital twin. And the talk will show that this is kind of our long-term goal. And what I hope to do is highlight some of the steps along the way that we have tried to tackle with AI machine learning and what we've been able to do and what still remains just a huge challenge for us to look at next. Toward getting to a human digital twin, like Deepak said, digital twin idea has been around in industry for decades. In the automobile industry, a virtual model could be built of an automobile, of a tire, and it can be simulated for different driving conditions before it is actually deployed and sold and used in the real world. And so what we want to do is use sensor expert knowledge and machine learning to build a human digital twin so that we can do a better job of health assessment and eventually have the same idea of designing interventions that are personalized and be able to anticipate what their impact will be in the virtual world before we try them out in the real world. So some of the motivation behind a human digital twin is the fact that there's so much more to understanding the relationship between health and behavior and other components of a person's life that then can be picked up with any one domain. So as an example, consider a patient, Jane, who presents with type 2 diabetes as well as cognitive decline due to Alzheimer's disease related dementias. Both conditions represent significant health concerns that impact our aging population. And we postulate that there are so many sources of information that affect both of these conditions and they impact each other, that we can do a more effective job at personalized medicine and intervention by trying to model as much as we can and fill in the pieces of the digital twin. So we know that sensors can passively and continuously collect data on Jane's physiology, on her behavior patterns. We can extract markers from collected data to assess components of Jane's health to predict some clinical measures. But ultimately, we want to complete the puzzle by also considering her genetics, her social interactions and social support, her medical family history, personal history, her physical built environment, and the fact that Jane is managing multiple chronic conditions that impact each other. There's a lot of work in looking at individual sets of information and individual health conditions. We've been finding through experience that if we can fuse multiple sources of information, we can do a better job at assessment and intervention. So that leads us to this long-term goal of creating the digital twin that encapsulates what we can directly sense, the information that is provided by experts, and where we just don't have the information, we will fill it in with machine learning techniques on the road to getting the rest of the puzzle filled in. So that's our long-term goal, build from what we see and use machine learning techniques to fill in the missing pieces. Where we start in this particular project of our digital twin is to initially link behavior and health. But even with that, we want to make it as personalized and complete as possible. So we tackle these challenges of sensing and modeling everything that we possibly can about a person's behavioral routine in the wild rather than in a laboratory setting. And from that, we construct individualized, personalized digital health approaches to assessment. And then I will finish out this particular discussion with using this digital twin in the version we have right now to design a personalized intervention, and then come full circle to use the intervention as a way of enhancing the digital twin and assessment. So this theme will appear throughout my describing these projects, in that these are our goals: to have a complete digital twin, to sense and model everything in the wild. And we encounter one roadblock after another in order to make that happen. And so with each one, we try to see what AI machine learning can do for us to overcome that particular challenge, and then find ways to generalize that particular AI contribution to the field as a whole. So we start by sensing and modeling everything that goes on in a person's behavioral routine in the wild. So there's a wealth of literature out there on human activity recognition and sensing particular aspects of a person's daily routine to find correlation with different health conditions. What we want to do is to capture all of a person's behavioral routine. So yes, we're interested in step counts, and yes, we're interested in taking medicine and medicine adherence, but we also recognize that exercise can take various forms. And we recognize that there could be health events of critical importance that we want to be able to detect and include. And there are some aspects of a person's behavioral routine that maybe don't fall into these traditional categories used for clinical assessment. It could be different kinds of social interaction. It could be pastimes and hobbies. It could be interacting with family members. It could be relaxing. And it can be those critical daily activities as well. So we want to try to capture all of what's going on in order to build our digital twin, starting from behavior and going outward. So some of the challenges that we face to do that are finding ways to perform activity recognition in these messy environments where the activities are not scripted, so the data are not pre-labeled. They are not pre-segmented, they're just messy. And then we, after that, notice that we can use the activity models that we build to not only describe a person's behavioral routine, but to do other tasks that aid each other, forecast future activity occurrences, find transitions between activities, and scale these activity models using domain adaptation so that we're not reliant on having ground truth labels for each new situation and person. So these activity modeling pieces are designed in a sensor agnostic manner. So some of the settings in which we have collected sensor data include smart homes. So this is our prototype smart home testbed on campus that one of our students lived in for a while. You can see motion sensors. They look like smoke detectors on the ceiling. You can see some labels on the cabinet's door because we also have magnetic door open closure sensors. And you can see this very simplistic model of what's going on in terms of the sensors firing, a motion sensor turning red as Jess moves, and a magnetic sensor indicating a door is open, which is a green rectangle as the cabinet door opens and shuts. And throughout all of Jess's activities, our computer just receives this continuous stream of text messages that indicate a sensor that sensed movement or door open shut, the corresponding time date, and the sensor identifier. So our goal in sensing and modeling everything is, first of all, to collect continuous sensor data, and secondly, to label it with corresponding activity names. And for us, the motivation for doing that is that activity labels give us a vocabulary for expressing a person's behavioral routine. So we can analyze time and variation for different activity categories, as well as location categories and other aspects of a routine that we want to model using machine learning. This is what the data look like in a smart home, but it's going to be very similar time series data for different sensor modalities as well. So we can do essentially the same thing with a smartwatch. In both cases, we have studies where we have collected continuous data. And in the watch case, now we don't have sensors that are discrete event sensors as in the smart home, where they only send a text message where there's a change in state. Now we have sensors that are sampled at a continuous rate, and they would indicate movement through accelerometers and gyroscopes, and location through location services found on the watch. So in both cases, we want to be able to come up with a method to model and recognize these activities in real time as they occur. As we do it, one of the first challenges that we face is the fact that while there are some traditional activities that are commonly used to explain a person's routine, or they may be used in traditional clinical assessments, they don't make up all of a person's behavioral routine. So for example, in the smart home setting, we wanted to get ground truth activity labels to train our machine learning algorithms. And we didn't ask the participants in our smart homes to provide their own labels. We didn't want to interrupt their routine. A lot of them were older adults, so there was this possibility of self-report error. So we used our visualizer and basic information the person provided about where and when they performed activities, and had external people provide ground truth labels in as consistent a manner as they could. And you can see that the traditional activity categories made up maybe a little bit more than half of the continuously collected labeled data. That's a problem for machine learning when you have such an extreme imbalanced class distribution, because when an algorithm is trying to optimize labeling accuracy, it's going to be able to do that by forcing most of its guesses to be in that other category. But the second problem is that you're missing all of those facets of a person's routine that are within the other category, or it might even be within other categories that are quite large. For example, in some of our watch data, maybe it was the demographic that we were monitoring initially, but a lot of the data were labeled work. And being able to understand the different components of work and how we spend our time. For example, you and I right now are just in a discussion. Other times we might be at the computer typing, and other times we might be in the classroom. For large categories, it's helpful to break it down, both to even the class distribution and to be able to model the facets that fall within the category. In the other category, in our experience, a lot of that was spent with socialization. It was spent with people doing their hobbies, such as playing the flute, practicing the piano, doing some crafting, or it could have been transitions between activities. That's what we found most often. So we wanted to reshape the space to make a more uniform distribution. There are machine learning techniques for doing that, like throwing away some of the data points in the larger space, or duplicating some of the points in the smaller portions of the space, or creating synthetic data. All of those have risks. So what we just wanted to do was reshape the space by decomposing the larger categories. It was as simple as that. And it looks like this. We receive our training data that are vastly imbalanced in terms of the labels. For the categories that are too large, we divide them into subclasses so that we get a close to uniform distribution. We build a classifier that recognizes all the predefined categories and all these automatically built subcategories and classify the data. So our traditional learning algorithm is going to move a window, and it can be fixed size or dynamic size, across the continuously collected sensor data, extract features, and then use a machine learning algorithm to map that feature vector onto an activity label. So where this method differs is that we first reshape the space by identifying the large activity categories, and those would be the categories that are significantly greater than the mean size of the categories. We use a traditional clustering algorithm to divide those categories into smaller subcategories, and then we model both the predefined categories and those automatically discovered subcategories. And we pick the number of clusters such that if the data points fit uniformly across the clusters, then we would end up with a uniform distribution of class sizes. So for us, it was important to do this so that we can model the facets within these bigger categories and to address the fundamental machine learning problem of having an imbalanced class distribution. But then we wanted to see, is this an approach that would generalize to machine learning as well? So we looked at 15 publicly available data sets that have known class distribution imbalance. And we wanted to see on how many of them we got statistically significant improvement using our method or two other common methods, SMOTE, which creates synthetic data, and resampling, which creates duplicates. And you can see both in terms of accuracy and F1 score that this idea of reshaping the space was able to achieve statistically significant improvement in more of these data sets than the other methods. And for us, what was important is that we don't lose any of the data by downsampling, nor do we create synthetic data points that could introduce noise. So that's just an example of what we have a goal. What can we do with machine learning and AI to get there? So we reshape the space. And then the next thing we do is we are looking at continuously collected data. So it's not already segmented into a person's going to perform an activity for 30 seconds. We know where the begin is and where the end is. So we designed change point techniques to detect those transitions for us, because instead of just moving a window, it would be useful to know how long has this particular activity been going on, because that length gives us insight into the activity that we're looking at. So we came up with a statistical method to detect change points and wanted to show that not only was our method better than previous statistical approaches to change point detection, where change points are just a detected difference in an underlying process that's generating data, in this case, sensor observations. So we were able to show that our method, SEP, detected transitions with a smaller delay than other previous methods to change point detection. But for us, the reason for introducing this AI technique was fundamentally to improve activity recognition by segmenting data. And you can see that, yes, it did improve accuracy and F1 score when we had that additional information. Plus, a byproduct of this, when we get to intervention, is that we have found when we design personalized interventions, one of the problems with interventions is interacting with the person and interrupting what they're doing in order to try to help them with doing those activities. So it's kind of a catch-22. And we found that when we interact with people during these detected transitions, that we would get a vastly improved response rate. In fact, better than some reported methods that used monetary incentives to get response rates. So once again, these AI machine learning techniques just kind of helped us along the way toward our goal. So we segmented the data, we reshape the space, we extract these features, and then we perform activity recognition with smart home sensors or mobile sensors. And in the case of homes, we had 50 homes where we performed continuous data collection over multiple years, and we would get at least 1 month of ground truth labeled activities, and then perform a leave one home out analysis. If we threw all of the data together, we would get an F1 score of 0.98 with the leave one home out 0.86, although recently we've gotten better than that. And then we did a clinical validation in which we asked people to validate whether the activity we recognized in real time was correct or not, and got 0.85 F1 score. Now, the mobile data is ongoing. We have done the same type of analysis with 100 subjects, 12 activities, and in this case had people label their own activities in real time. And we have a lower F1 score than we have seen before. So this is a work in progress that we can talk about during the discussion if that's of interest to you, some of the challenges that we're still trying to overcome with AI and machine learning. All right, so that's part of sensing and modeling everything. Another part of sensing and modeling everything is being able to forecast when activities are going to occur. And again, that's useful for us to build the digital twin and to personalize intervention, because we want to be able to provide in the moment personalized support for activities, and it's helpful to know when that activity would normally occur. So if we have the ability to automatically label activities, then we have the ability to automatically predict when an activity is going to occur again, because we can look at historic data and know at this point in time, it was 6 hours until Diane took her medicine again. It was 5 hours until Diane took her dog for a walk. And if we have that updated model, and that particular activity has passed and Diane has not gone for a walk, she has not taken her medicine, then we can provide automated support. So we built an activity forecaster that would predict when an activity would occur again. And the reason I bring this up is that this will be useful in our discussion of the intervention, but it's also the first thing we did that really led toward this idea of a digital twin. Initially, when we were trying to forecast activities, we built a separate regression model for every activity. So we would predict the number of time units until a person would take medicine, and we'd have a different model that would predict the number of time units until a person would eat their next meal. But what we were missing out on was the fact that these predictions influence each other, because a person may take their medicine with food. And so if we can predict when they're going to eat, we can use that information to do a better job of predicting when they will take medicine, and vice versa. So we took two approaches to forecasting. One was to have independent models for each activity, and the second was a joint forecasting method where we initially predicted each activity independently, and then in a second pass added those predictions to an expanded feature vector and did a second round of refinement to our predictions. And we see here with the normalized RMSE scores that this joint prediction dramatically outperformed independent prediction. And that's what initially motivated us to not look at pieces of information in isolation, but to combine these pieces of information, not just sensor data, but the actual predictions that we are trying to make, because they influence each other. So sense everything and model everything, also being able to scale. So the other AI component to this sense and model everything is domain adaptation, which for us occurs because we have data from a lot of human subjects and labeled data for a small fraction of them. And so we also look at AI machine learning techniques for scaling those models to cases where we don't have labeled data. And this is an ongoing project in which I'm sure many of you are familiar with generative adversarial networks that are used to create synthetic, very realistic synthetic data using two learning algorithms, where one of the algorithms, the agent, is a counterfeiter, tries to come up with synthetic data that could fool anybody. And the second agent is the detective that tries to determine if the data are real or fake. So we use this a slightly different way. We use our generative adversarial network to try to create domain invariant features that allow us to build model from one person or set of people and use it in a new situation or with a new person. So the counterfeiter tries to propose these features and map the data. The detective tries to determine, did the data come from the original domain with labeled data or the new one? And so the secret sauce is the fact that they are learning and getting more capable at the same rate, which makes them more powerful in the long run. So we use this to scale our activity models by taking multiple source domains with labeled data. So that would be as many people for whom we have labeled data and our target for whom we don't have any labeled data, and effectively map over our models to this new case. And we even show that if you have some information, you can improve upon this. So this is currently under review. We do have results showing that we can not only outperform no adaptation and other adaptation methods, but with each new source domain we can add, it performs better. And if we have some information in our target domain, like if a person can tell us, I sleep approximately 8 hours a night, I spend approximately this much time cooking, then you can add that distribution information into your loss function and get better results yet. Okay, a lot of different points, but this was all on the way to creating what we would call the behaviorome. And that is like just the germ, the beginning of our digital twin. That is the model of a person's behavioral routine. And we needed all those prior pieces along the way to come up with this behaviorome, which is our set of digital behavior markers, because we can include in these markers how much time and time of day is spent on different activities and in different locations. And what is the regularity of a person's schedule? What is the circadian rhythm? How does it change from weekday to weekend and from one week to the next? Some of these markers we observed in our early studies were strongly associated with changes in cognitive and physical health. So we wanted to be able to extract them automatically as well. So once we have this beginning of a digital twin, which starts with the digital behavior markers, the behaviorome, then we started using this for step 2, which is personalized assessment. So in our first attempt at this, we used that smart home data collected for multiple years with participants living in their own independent apartments. And Maureen's team from neuropsychology would visit the participants every 6 months and administer traditional clinical assessment tests. Every assessment point is indicated by an arrow here and would occur every 6 months. Our goal was to be able to extract a behaviorome or digital behavior markers for the 6 months leading up to that assessment point and see if we could predict what those clinical scores would be from the behavior markers. And some of the scores that we highlighted were selected because they look at different facets of health. So we use R-bands as a proxy for cognitive health, TUG, the timed up and go test, for mobility measurement as well as cognitive health. And then my colleague Maureen has designed her own measure, instrumental activities of daily living with a compensatory component. with a hypothesis that the traditional assessment using activities of daily living doesn't always take into account that individuals with memory decline can still use compensatory techniques like notepads and tech-based reminders to help them be functionally independent. So she came up with her own measure, and we were interested in seeing how well we could predict these 3 sets of measures from the behavioral. So we were able to find moderate or large correlation with this multi-year data for approximately 30 homes. And you can see that that included R-band score, the TUG score, and IADLC, although this was a slightly lower correlation depending on the subscale that we looked at. That was our first attempt at this, and we wanted to see what insights we could gain from this. One thing that we found over time was, again, the need for a digital twin, because we found that predicting some clinical measures did better with one sensor modality and type of feature vector. Others did better with a different modality. So more recently, we did a study in which we collected both sources of information, smart home data and smartwatch data. And we performed joint inference, not only fusing these sources of information, but again, trying to predict a set of different measures and using the prediction of the other measures in an enhanced feature vector to boost predicted performance of each clinical measure. And once again, we found that fusing information, not only sensor sources, but also the different clinical components, outperformed looking at any one sensor source or information source. So here we're looking at correlation between our predicted measures and the ground truth. And the blue numbers indicate that the best result came from the smartwatch, red from the smart home, green from a combination of the two. But this is a very small sample, but what we wanted to highlight was that this joint inference outperforms looking at individual measures independently. So again, that's kind of pushing us toward this digital twin. And then the final piece that I want to talk about today is intervention. And not only how digital twin can be used in intervention, but how the intervention can be used as part of the digital twin. And the intervention I will focus on here is, again, an outcome of work with Maureen Schmitter-Edgecombe, who has been designing a digital memory notebook for a long time as a type of cognitive prosthesis for individuals with memory decline. This would be initially a pen and paper version of a journal that individuals could go to for all of their daily most critical information, their medical information, their contacts. But what I found really interesting was also they're using the journal, the notebook as a journal, to record conversations that they had had. So if they were going to see somebody again, they could look at what was that conversation and reseed the context of the conversation, which would make it easier for them to pick up where they left off. So we created a digital version of this memory notebook in which we perform multiple iterations of participatory design. So we would have older adults and their caregivers come in and give us feedback. A lot of the tech that's out there is not designed with older adults in mind. So over multiple rounds, we found that we did a better job when we used large fonts and bright contrasting colors and really meaningful icons. And we would actually measure how effectively they could perform tasks with each new design as well. So right now, this is in a clinical trial. So we will be reporting the results as it finishes up. But one key thing I want to point out is that this digital memory notebook partners with sensor data sources, in this case, a smart home partnership, where the smart home would monitor people performing activities, model them, label them, forecast them, and give that information to the digital memory notebook, which would check off when the home detected they performed specific activities using the activity model. And then using activity forecasting would prompt them for an activity that they deemed as important If the time came for them to perform that activity, came and passed, and they hadn't started the activity, then it would give them an alert. So I have a quick video that I will talk over of this partnership. This is Jess, again, living in our on-campus home. And the smart home is detecting that Jess is taking her medicine. She has designated that as an important activity, and she's also designated eating as an important activity, using that joint activity forecasting that was actually built on a model in this smart home with Jess living there. It detected that Jess typically eats around the time that she takes medicine, but she did not eat at that time. And so it's prompting her, and there's some sounds and lights that go off at the tablet, say, you know, come look at the message on the tablet. And it told her to remember to eat. And so she grabbed an apple, and the smart home detected that she did that and updated its display. So here is the actual tablet application. And it's a little bit small, but you will see it detected that she took medicine, prompted her to eat, and then finally detected that she did eat. So it checked that off. So this is an example of how we use that activity model and the beginnings of our digital twin to personalize the digital memory notebook smart home-based intervention. But what I want to close with is that no piece of information, no digital footprint is too small or too unimportant to include in the digital twin. So we feel that interventions should actually be included in the design and construction and filling in the pieces of our digital twin. So we did one more study in which we tried to predict clinical assessment measures, and we used demographic information. We used those smart home behavior markers that I mentioned before, but we also used markers of usage of the intervention. And when they employed the journal component of the digital memory notebook, we extracted text markers like sentiment and word complexity, linguistic markers, and such markers from the task description information they also wrote down on a daily basis, their to-do list. And we wanted to see, again, is the whole greater than the sum of the parts? You know, do our assessment models benefit from all of these sources of information, as well as joint prediction? So with joint prediction, once again, we're going to have a collection, as you see on the x-axis, a collection of clinical measures that we're going to try to predict. And because there's a relationship between them, that joint inference in every case outperformed independent inference. The exact machine learning model that's used is indicated in the bottom boxes, and it varies from one measure to the next. And you can also see that there's only one case in which no fusion of the different sources of information, meaning the demographics, the app usage, the smart home markers, perform better than some kind of fusion, either early fusion, where we just concatenate all of the markers from the different sources, or early fusion with dimensionality reduction through an autoencoder, or late fusion where every information source has its own machine learning model that are then combined in an ensemble. So we see that in general, fusing this information outperforms one information source on its own, that joint prediction outperforms independent prediction, and that even an intervention can provide insights that help with assessment, which will in turn better inform the intervention. So our next steps are just to try to complete the digital twin, see what impact other information sources have on assessment and personalization of interventions. With all of these machine learning strategies that we're generating, we are now accompanying them with joint generation of text explanations as well as automated classifications to help build interpretable models to aid in clinical translation. And then ultimately, like I mentioned at the very beginning, we want to use this information not only to improve assessment, but like with the automobile digital twin, we want to actually be able to forecast the potential impact of an intervention by predicting these measures with and without the introduction of an intervention. So those are our ongoing long-term goals. Thank you for letting me talk about some of this work, and I would love to hear your questions.
Thank you, Diane. That was really interesting. So we'll take questions. If folks have questions, please feel free to raise your hand and or put your questions in the chat box. I think we have time, so I'm happy to take questions. But I can start off if I can start the questions off. So Diane, very interesting work. So I was struck by a number of things, but one is that that the behaviorome is built currently, at least, on the regular behaviors, presumably in the rhythms, as you say, right? Because that's where there's enough history to be able to predict behavior into the future. But I'm also wondering, there's a lot of value in these not so regular behaviors as well, right? If somebody walks outside stumbles once in a while, that gives you some fall risk type of assessment. If somebody is in a high stress, like walks faster than they normally do, and their cardiac, if you can measure heart rate these days, and maybe that you see something different, that gives you some kind of a heart risk. So I'm just curious about, as we think about behaviorome, there's the current step, which you clearly, I think, makes a lot of sense to go after the rhythms and predict the rhythms and intervene on the rhythms. But there's other information, and just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I was trying to look for a slide that talks about some of our work in that area. I like this idea. So the slide I was going to try to find is we, in another study that I didn't really have time to talk about today, created a behavior change detection algorithm in which we would compare a unit of time against a baseline and quantify the amount of change, and then determine whether the change was statistically significant or not, in an effort to try to detect clinically meaningful changes in behavior. And in that initial study, we were able to find changes that correlated with, for example, let me go ahead and share this. For example, this was one of our participants in a smart home, and we used a week early on in the data collection in which she indicated that everything was normal behaviorally and in terms of her mood and health, and used that as a baseline, and then quantified every week after that against baseline. This is a person who was diagnosed with lung cancer. The red line on the y-axis indicates a threshold beyond which the change would be statistically significant. Interestingly, she was diagnosed here during the first week that crosses that red line. And she said that she didn't really feel much impact when she received that diagnosis, but her behavior indicates maybe not. And then when we generated heat maps of those exact changes so that we could interpret them, we saw that she was just lying on the couch more, maybe absorbing the information. This green dashed line indicated when she began chemotherapy, and you can see that there were sustained weeks of change, not only after the treatment began, but even before. Less sleep at night, more sleep during the day, and a lot more people entering the home, probably to give her support and care. So we have looked at some ability to detect and quantify the behavior change. What we have not done is integrated that into the behaviorome, and that's a great idea and one we should and will consider.
Thank you. Misha, go ahead.
Excellent talk. Just love it. I have two questions. One is specific, and another one is a little bit more general. So the first is specific one. When I look at the distribution, the graph, the sort of circular diagram of your activities, I realized that it wasn't a time, it was activities based on events, right? Because, for example, sleep was only 4%, and I'm even I get a little more of that. So I was wondering if you would actually interpolate and figure out the duration, the timing, we would get much more sort of better distributed. So I was wondering if you thought of that.
Excellent question. So let me bring up that slide because I wasn't sure if that would be caught or not. And the reason that sleep takes up more of our wall clock time than it takes up a percentage on this pie chart is that this was based on data collected in a smart home using discrete event sensors that only report a reading when there's a change in state. And so with infrared motion sensors, there's very little movement while somebody sleeps. So the corresponding number of sensor readings is quite small. But in creating the behaviorome, we do compute amount of time spent on these activities, including sleep. So it didn't have a class distribution problem in terms of duration because we were labeling based on the actual sensor readings. Yeah, so we include that in the behaviorome.
Excellent. And the second question is more general. Human beings, even the most regular ones, are not completely predictable, right? A lot of our activities are actually contaminated with uncertainty. So predicting specific activity, specific moment will be probably not reasonable. So it might be worth to think about how to do the probabilistic version of this approach, this digital twin. I was wondering if you have thoughts about that.
I think that's a good idea, particularly when we go from building the twin to deploying it in terms of an intervention. For example, the ability to, and I think you probably know this based on work that was done before us with Intel, going from wall clock based reminders to contextual reminders improves accuracy. And we're not the first to show that, you guys in Intel looked at that, but that doesn't mean that the reminder should be given every time. So I agree that the confidence probability distribution should be incorporated there. That is something to consider. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sudeshna?
Yeah, great talk. Really enjoyed it, and I love the way how you boil down very complex models and data into like such simple slides. I mean, clearly there's a lot of work and modeling behind. So I want to ask you, like, have you thought of, are you looking at adding clinical data, perhaps from electronic health records, onto your behaviorome, and what kind of steps have you taken in that direction, and the many challenges that you may have faced for that?
Many challenges. We think that analyzing sensor data are complex and noisy. That's a whole other explosion of difficulty. We are, and we're tackling it by not doing it ourselves. We're tackling it by working with teams that are actually experts in that area, but then we're integrating those markers into our assessment. And as you know, there are so many interesting challenges there that open up machine learning areas of, for example, time series analysis with irregularly sampled data, and of course, all of the natural language variability. It's exciting. So we are, but we aren't. We're just doing the integration.
That's great. Thank you.
Holly?
Hi, I just wanted to thank you so much for this really enlightening talk and incredible results. And you explain it so well. It feels so compelling, and yet I'm glad you're introducing the concept of behaviorome. And to get this taken more seriously by the rest of the medical community, where we know how important home health behaviors are and in predicting health outcomes. And yet these concepts aren't integrated at all into clinical care, really. And I'm wondering, I mean, you've done some careful work with Maureen and in predicting what might happen from a neuropsychological level, or, but how do you see getting this work to be integrated into clinical care or taken seriously by clinicians in a more holistic approach to healthcare?
I want to sit down and have a much longer talk with you on that. I think a lot of this is just my opinion based on being on the tech side, working with Maureen and Shelley, who are on the clinical side, and talking with one company after another who wants to get into this space and then kind of drops out after a few years. I was recently on a panel at the Consumer Electronics Show in which we had this discussion, and there's such a dichotomy because tech is so fast, try and fail and try again. And healthcare is so conservative, risk averse, do no harm, that first of all, I feel that there needs to be a lot more clinical validation for that to be accepted and interpretable models so that when the decision contradicts traditional measures, that it can be explained. So, I mean, that's kind of the easy answer, is that's how, you're in that space. That's how new laboratory clinical measures are introduced, is through lots of large scale validation. And it's difficult to come up with the funding and manpower to do that. So I'm not sure it'll be any one study. I'm guessing it'll just be the inertia of a mass of people working in the similar space saying over and over again, this behavior marker, is showing up over and over again in all of these studies. But I also like what some clinicians have done, and that is come at it from the other point of view. And that is not necessarily to take the behaviorome as a whole and say, let's use this instead of our lab-based assessment, but maybe introduce new lab-based assessment techniques that integrate pieces of that, so that you're kind of pulling in bits and pieces into the traditional setting rather than having it be the other way around.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, room for a lot more discussion there.
Yes,
Great.
I would value your insights for sure.
Oh, thank you.
Great. One last question from Jandu.
Hey, thank you. This is a very nice talk. I feel very interested. So my question is about the sensors. So I believe you used a lot of sensors here. So based on your experience of your experiments, if we need to set up sensor to monitor like patients, old people's healthcare, so can you give us some suggestion on the sensors based on the priority level? Which sensors do you think will be more important? I know you use
a hard question. And I think, I hope that an outcome of this talk would be that there's no silver bullet sensor. And I think that it's going to depend on the application. Here's just anecdotal information that I'm trying to assimilate on the fly. We have found it much easier to model behavior from smart home sensors, even though they're coarser granularity, because first of all, they're completely passive. They don't require any action on the part of the participant. And within the confines of a home, it seems, at least early on, that behavior is more structured. And so the daily routines have been a little bit easier to model, and changes have been easier to detect from that setting. Now, that said, the granularity is very coarse, and so trying to look at any kind of movement information or movement outside the confines of that built environment is near impossible. And so it needs to be complemented with other sensor sources. I don't know if this is answering your information, but again, we could have an hour-long discussion, because we have looked at depth cameras and item sensors and wearable sensors and home sensors, and they all have their pros and cons.
Thank you, Diane. So one last question, maybe just from Amar.
Oh, thank you. Thanks a lot, Diane. That was a really great talk. I mean, there's so many concepts you went over on activity monitoring and how to use these machine learning networks. It was really illuminating for me. I appreciate that. I have a question from the perspective of someone who's trying to measure changes in physiology. So it's sort of a follow-up to the previous question. My question was actually going to be, what is the minimal set of sensors that you need to actually identify an activity? But I think you've done a great job of just explaining that there's no silver bullet on that. So one question I had is, like, do you have any interest in looking at changes in physiology that happen during transitions in activities? Because, you know, in my mind, like the traditional way of like measuring a physiology like blood pressure, you sit on a bench and you just measure it. But I think there's a lot more interesting physiology that happens at transitions between activities when you're going from a seated to standing position, for example. Yeah. Could your models and activity monitoring devices that detect events, could they be used to inform such types of physiologic measurements, which specifically target a change in activity or transition?
Absolutely. And I'm really inspired by that idea. I can see the rationale for looking at that. I can see where that's kind of a critical time in terms of monitoring safety, and critical in terms of detecting somebody's health. So yes, you can obviously look at the speed of transition, the physiological readings that occur during that transition. How difficult is it for a person? How much stress is there involved in making that transition? Could be done with wearable. A lot of that in terms of the type. I'm thinking back to a person's paper on predicting clinical scores just based on delta values in a smart home. So some little tiny piece of what you're talking about has been looked at, and the number of transitions and transitions between what types of location within the home were used primarily as the vocabulary for that study. But to my knowledge, that's been the only foray into that area, and there was no automated detection of the transition times. So I think that would be valuable. I think it has not been done, so let's do it.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I'll follow up with you with an email on that. And just one other thing is real quick. Have you, since you've worked in large teams, have you ever encountered any resistance to the privacy issues on, people being monitored, like the value of it versus the burden of it versus the giving up your privacy?
Maybe just a quick answer, Diane, before we end the.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I know people might have to leave.
Is that a good quick answer? Yes. And the perception of privacy has been greater with smart home sensors. I think the reality of privacy risk is actually greater with wearables. And so it's an issue that we do need to discuss. And it's difficult because we want to share data. And we have to I have a lot of wearable data with clinical scores that I want to make available to the community. But first, we have to be careful and do due diligence with respect to that.
Great.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you all. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you, Diane, and thank you to all the questionnaires as well. So questions as well. So thank you, folks, and see you next time.